This lecture and the next lecture are going to tease you or frustrate you. I don't know which. Maybe a little bit of both. Because although it seems like we spent a lot of time on the Prince and on the discourses, ultimately even there, given the fact, especially that the Prince is a short book, even there, in some ways we just scratched the surface. And I had to pick and choose some things to emphasize. Well, if that was true for the Prince and the discourses, the book we're turning to now, the Florentine Histories by Machiavelli, it's his longest book. And yet, I'm only going to spend 2 lectures talking about it. Now, that's not because there's anything intrinsically inferior here to the other things that he wrote. It's basically some choices I made. Because what I've chosen to do is try to draw out the main part of Machiavelli's thought from the Prince and the discourses. And I've talked a lot about the way Machiavelli views history from his reading of Livy in the discourses. Now he turns historian on us. He's going to write some history, and we're going to see ways in which his ideas come out as he tells the story of his own hometown, which of course is also his own home country, his patria, if you will, his fatherland, which is Florence. And so I'm going to be very quick about this, but it's a book, again, that's worth reading and worth spending some time with. Let me point out that although there are not as many translations available of this as there are, say, The Prince, the translation I'm using uses the title Florentine Histories, plural, which is a literal translation of the Italian. Now, there are other translations, and sometimes it's called The History of Florence, for example, but this is a translation done by Banfield and Mansfield. Sounds like it's a made-up vaudeville act, but it isn't. Banfield and Mansfield, and it's published by Princeton University Press. So I just want you to know what I'm reading from, because I'm going to read a few times, and what I'm looking at, so that if you want to follow along, this is the translation that I recommend. Well, let's put this in, as we always do, historical context. Remember that Machiavelli lost his job when the Medici came into Florence in 1512. And remember, the Prince could be seen as a kind of job application to the Medici in 1513. A different government in Florence, but hey guys, I want a job, and here's me showing my stuff. That is a way to read the Prince, as I pointed out. Not a full way, not a sufficient way, but also not an outrageous way of reading the Prince. Well, ultimately, for several years, Machiavelli didn't get a job in Florence. And then finally, in 1520, sort of his way back now, he is commissioned to write a history of Florence by a member of the Medici, Giulio de' Medici, in 1520. Now, it's important to realize this is a commissioned work, and it's commissioned by the Medici, and much of the book is about the Medici. So that the question we obviously want to ask is, to what extent did Machiavelli flatter, kowtow to the Medici? To what extent did he see this as a job audition? Gee, if the Medici like the history book I write, they'll give me another job, a more important job, or whatever it might be, a more policy-making job. It's hard to say. Certainly, he is not uncritical of the Medici, even of Cosimo, the most beloved, in a sense, of all the Medici, the first Medici ruler of Florence. Nevertheless, Machiavelli does make some interesting choices. For example, he ends his book in 1492 with the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, rather than in 1494 with the expulsion of Piero de' Medici after the disastrous reaction that he made to the French invasion. So those are probably clever choices that Machiavelli made. By the way, this Giulio de' Medici guy, you might say, who is he? Well, shortly after he commissioned this work, he was elected as Pope Clement VII. And so by the time the work was done and presented to the patron, it was presented indeed to the Pope. All I can do in this lecture and the next lecture is to suggest something of the scope and the richness of the work, rather than retell the story that Machiavelli tells from the founding of Florence, and to some extent sketching in all Italy as background up to the year 1492. Let me suggest that when we study any historian's work, we need to think a little bit about what did history and the practice and writing of history mean in that time. History clearly meant something different to Machiavelli, not totally different, than it does to us, because our idea of history has changed. History as a social science with a kind of scientific or social scientific, or some would say pseudoscientific base to it, for example, is a 19th century idea. It's an idea of the modern world. So we would not expect Machiavelli to, if you will, play by the rules of modern historians, and especially of modern academic historians. We need to be aware of the fact that Machiavelli follows in the humanist tradition of historical writing in 15th and 16th century Florence. And of course, that is deeply influenced by the writing of ancient historians, such as, but not only including Livy, for example. So let me give you one example of how Machiavelli fits the humanist model following the classical model. As far back as ancient Athens in the 5th century BC, historians, I'll use Thucydides as an example, wrote speeches that they presented as direct discourse in their history. So the most famous of these is the funeral oration of Pericles in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Well, Machiavelli employs that technique. There are numbers of set speeches in the Florentine histories, none of which Machiavelli heard in person. And so they are recreations. Partly it's a way for Machiavelli to give his opinions about certain things or his interpretations of certain events. So we need to be aware that those speeches are not found in archives and they're not in transcripts, but they are part of a tradition of historical writing. Machiavelli, as much as he's an heir to humanist historical writing, is not afraid to criticize or disagree with other historians of Florence, just as he was not afraid to disagree with so august an authority as Livy, as we saw in the discourses. Machiavelli makes the point that other historians, and he means ancient historians, and he means historians of Florence, even some who are more or less his contemporaries, overvalue traditional morality as the tool by which to judge historical figures. In other words, he says, historians spend too much time saying, this guy wasn't a nice guy, therefore I condemn him. This guy lied, or this guy dissimulated, or this guy was a fox, and therefore I think he was not one of the good people of history. We should expect that Machiavelli would criticize that attitude, knowing what we know about Machiavelli's views from the Prince and the Discourses. And, again, perhaps not surprisingly, more than his contemporary historians or near contemporary historians of Florence and Italy, Machiavelli praises successful outcomes. Again, this is perfectly consonant with what we heard Machiavelli say in The Prince. We need to look to see what the goals are, and assuming those goals are good, then what we want to do is see how effective somebody was in achieving those goals. And if it involved a little lying, a little dissimulation, a little cruelty, for that matter, well, as we know, Machiavelli tends to excuse and even praise that because of the fact they were useful means to get to the goal that was established. And so Machiavelli's history, the judgments he makes on various characters, and more Machiavelli than most historians today, he's not hesitant to make judgments, not hesitant to say good guy, bad guy, praise, condemn. Those are words that he's comfortable using in his history. We see that in general, as a practitioner of history, writing about the history of Florence, we see him manifesting in his historical writing ideas he puts forth in The Prince and the Discourses. Like other historians, both ancient and Renaissance, Machiavelli's history is almost entirely what we would call political history, and virtually ignores cultural, intellectual, and social history, which are so much a part of modern historiography for us. Here are my examples of how much that is true. We know how devastating the bubonic plague was when it came to Italy and to Florence in 1348, probably killing off half the Florentines in 1 year. The Black Death, as we call that event, gets just a few lines in this very thick history of Florence. If you think about the great cultural superstars of Renaissance Florence, an early Renaissance painter like Giotto, or the designer of the great dome of Florence Cathedral, Brunelleschi's dome, Brunelleschi and Giotto are actually both mentioned, but neither one particularly as artists. They just are mentioned in passing in narrating political events. So if you are interested in seeing what a 16th century person like Machiavelli thought of the great cultural events that we think of when we see the word Renaissance, this is not the book you want. This is a political history, and almost entirely a political history. Well, let me start now, roll up my sleeves a little bit, and say, let's go. Let's do Florentine history, Machiavelli style. Book 1, it's divided into 8 books, by the way, 8 sections. Book 1 is a general history of Italy, beginning with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. So he takes us through what happens to Italy in what we would call today the transitional period between classical antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And although obviously I'm not going to narrate as he narrates, let me make a point here that one of Machiavelli's great themes, which he articulates at the beginning of his book, is that historians have misunderstood the meaning and importance of discord in societies. Now, we know that's a theme that Machiavelli has brought up before. He talks about it in the discourses. Usually people moan and groan about discord. Cicero moaned and groaned about discord. Can't we all get along? Was sort of Cicero's way of looking at things. But we know that Machiavelli said, no, you're missing the point. Discord can be good. Discord can lead to terrible things. You can't just automatically say discord is bad. There would be no full-blown Republican constitution in Rome, Machiavelli had said, without discord. And so Machiavelli turns at the beginning to the theme of discord and what it means. And he continues that theme, by the way, through all 8 books of the histories. And therefore, I'm going to skip ahead and look at a couple passages where he talks about discord. Let me read, for example, from the beginning of Book 3. The grave and natural enmities that exist between the men of the people and the nobles, caused by the wish of the latter to command and the former not to obey, are the cause of all evils that arise in states. For from the diversity of humors, all other things that agitate republics take their nourishment. This kept Rome disunited. Listen to the word. This kept Rome disunited. And this, if it is permissible to compare little things with great, has kept Florence divided. Okay, there's a difference between disunited and divided, although diverse effects were produced in one city and the other. For the enmities between the people and the nobles at the beginning of Rome that were resolved by disputing were resolved in Florence by fighting. Those in Rome ended with the law. Those in Florence with the exile and death of many citizens. Those in Rome always increased military virtue. Those in Florence eliminated it altogether. Those in Rome brought the city from equality in the citizens to a very great inequality. Those in Florence reduced it from inequality to a wonderful equality. So although not all the features of discord in Rome were good, and not all the features of discord in Florence were bad, by and large, one was good and one was bad. And therefore, he's going to be very interested in the difference between discord in Florence and discord in ancient Rome. After all, this is the guy who wrote the Discourses, who knows his Roman history very well. Let me skip all the way to Book 7 for a second and give you a short passage that follows up this theme once again. But first, he writes, I want to say something reasoning in accordance with our custom about how those who hope that a republic can be united are very much deceived in this hope. It is true that some divisions are harmful to republics and some are helpful. Those are harmful that are accompanied by sects and partisans. Those are helpful that are maintained without sects and partisans. It's a very interesting distinction he makes. You know, we use some of the same language today. We talk about whether, in fact, in our society, Democrats and Republicans having different points of view, debating, looking at things from different angles is a good or a bad thing. And we go back and forth on this. Sometimes we have people defend that two-party system. Other times we have people say, no, we've got to get rid of partisanship completely. Partisanship is a bad thing. We argue about whether bipartisan is a better word than nonpartisan. But Machiavelli understands that some difference, some distinction, some disagreement can be good, some bad. But in Florence, as he says, it turns out much worse than in Rome, because in Florence, the losing side didn't just find a way to regroup and continue the discussion. The losing side got kicked out. Of course, the best example, the most famous example of that is in 1301, when Dante was on the losing side of a factional strife, and he was not only kicked out of Florence, but he was sentenced to death in absentia. A story, by the way, that Machiavelli tells in this book, the Florentine Histories. Let me also point out that Machiavelli, like Livy, was not an archival historian. He didn't go say, gosh, let me go read all the stuff that's tucked away in the tax office and the secretary's office and all this sort of stuff. Machiavelli basically relied on what was already publicly known. He didn't make new discoveries, but rather Machiavelli retold from his own point of view a story that intelligent and well-educated Florentines already knew. He took information that was already available in other histories, but of course he gives it his own take, his own perspective, or to use a word in a non-prejudicial way, his own bias is what we see. Now, needless to say, historians today look at Machiavelli's work and they say, well, gosh, he made some mistakes. There are some factual errors, and indeed there are. Also, sometimes historians today would be virtually unanimous in saying Machiavelli misunderstood X or Y or Z. So if you are looking at wanting to read a book about Florence that gets you as close to the historical truth about the place and as accurate a picture of the place as you possibly can, again, this is probably not your book. We read this because there are some genuine and interesting historical insights, but we read it also as another expression of Machiavelli's thought, a way of seeing him apply many of the principles he laid out using historical examples, as disconnected as they were, in the Prince and the Discourses, and putting them together within the context of a narrative that he creates. Well, he goes on after sort of doing the dissolution of the Roman Empire and the what we would call the early Middle Ages in just a few pages. After all, we don't know much about those periods. He spends a good deal of time still looking at Italy, not specifically at Florence, talking about the Guelphs and Ghibellines, the struggle between the two major factions that exist in most Italian cities, really in the 13th century, although it continued after that time, where one side supported the international cause of the Pope and one side supported the international cause of the Holy Roman Emperor. The papal side is the Guelph side. The imperial, the Holy Roman Emperor side, is the Ghibelline side. And before he turns specifically to Florence, he actually takes what looks to us like a little bit of a detour and says, by the way, while I'm at it, let me tell you about Venice. Because A, Venice has a very different history. It's not an ancient city that had a decline following the end of the Roman Empire and then rose up again in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, like Florence or Lucca or Siena or Pisa or other cities did. If you go to Venice today, you won't find any Roman ruins because it wasn't a Roman city. So he wants to take a look at Venice for a couple reasons. One is Venice claimed, and this is perhaps more mythology than history, that Venice was founded as a republic way back at the end of the Roman Empire, and that 1,000 years later it's still a republic, and therefore claims to be the oldest republic, the one that's lasted the longest, even longer than Rome. Again, a lot of this is myth that the Venetians themselves created, but it is a powerful myth in Machiavelli's day, and he wants to examine it. A second reason that he wants to take some time out and talk about Venice is because in 1494, when the Medici were kicked out, and there is this idea, let's form a republic now, let's do a new constitution, there were many who said, let's take the model of Venice. There was almost a kind of putting Venice on a pedestal. It had been around so long, and it really had never been very seriously attacked, although God knows it lost a lot of battles, that there was this idea that Venice is the great Republican model. Machiavelli was not nearly as taken, he was not nearly as much in love with the Venetian model as many of his fellow Florentines, both before his time and after his time, for that matter. And so part of what he wants to do is examine Venice carefully and, as you would expect, do a little separating of myth from history as much as he can do that. And I think try to bring Venice down a notch, not because he was anti-Venetian, but that he thought that Venice had a higher reputation than it deserved. In Book 2, Machiavelli focuses more on the city of Florence, okay? Italy first. Now, let's go back and look at that same period of time, beginning with the founding of Florence, and let's look at it from a Florentine perspective now that I've set the Italian context. Notice that this is one of the great contributions Machiavelli makes to history. He's a big context guy. You could probably almost say about Machiavelli, the more context, the better. And he criticizes historians and people who use historical examples who do those things without sufficient context. The less context you have, the more you're going to misunderstand. So he looks into this debate that was taking place in Florence, whether Florence was founded in Roman Republican times, which is what Roman Republicans tended to say, or whether it was founded in imperial times, which was the older interpretation of the origins of Florence. He looks at that and decides the argument for the imperial foundation of Rome rather than the republican foundation of Rome is more likely to be true. Having said that, he covers the first 1,200 years of Florentine history very quickly, again, because there are almost no documents. And he focuses on an event in 1215 that is something medieval chroniclers focused on and something that Dante focused on, because in that year, there was an outbreak of violence between two families over a sort of marriage gone awry, or an engagement gone awry, actually, in Florence, that Dante and the chroniclers, and Machiavelli agrees, really began the serious factionalization of Florence. And later on, those two parties, one identifies as Guelph and one identifies as Ghibelline. Probably people who know something about the Guelph-Ghibelline struggle in Florence know it because they've read Dante, especially Dante's Inferno, where many of the stories that Machiavelli narrates are in fact included in the great poem of Dante. After all, Dante was exiled in one part of those disputes after the conquest of the Guelphs by the Guelphs of the Ghibellines. Then the Guelphs split into factions. Dante was in the losing Guelph faction. He was a white Guelph. The black Guelphs won out. Dante's kicked out, never comes home. Since this is a political, and we might even say constitutional history that Machiavelli writes, let me point out that one of the events he focuses on is an event that took place in the year 1293. In many ways, it's one of the redoings of the Florentine Constitution. And at that time, basically middle-class merchants were able to impose a form of government that says those who are part of the formal nobility of Florence, people with titles and whatever, are not allowed to hold offices in the Florentine Republic. It was to be essentially a middle-class and merchant government. It was not to be a government by nobles. And we've seen in the discourses that Machiavelli talks about disputes between nobles and common people. And we know that in general, Machiavelli says that nobles really need to be under tight control. There shouldn't be very many of them. They shouldn't have castles. You don't want them so powerful that the people all want to be like them. So here he looks at this constitutional change. It wasn't a permanent constitutional change because of all the turmoil in Florence, but he looks at it, interestingly, because we know that he thinks the nobles really need to be controlled in a republic. Nobles are perhaps a necessary part of a republic, but ultimately they're dangerous to a republic because, well, they sort of think they are better than everybody else and deserves things that other people don't deserve. And it also tends to be a closed group. You don't want to let other people in very much. Now, as I said, Machiavelli tells the famous stories that Dante retells and goes through Dante's exile. Another place he stops to look is in the year 1342, because in that year, Florence was such a political mess. There was a real economic crisis and whatever, such a mess that they called in a strong man from outside to take over. We call him the Duke of Athens. His name is Walter of Brienne. As I pointed out in the historical lecture way back, he was not, in fact, a Greek, but rather a Frenchman. But they very quickly kicked him out. And interestingly enough, the very first speeches that Machiavelli makes up come from the time of the Duke of Athens, and great speeches about Florentine freedom and what a mistake we've made and all that sort of stuff. Again, interesting Republican language that Machiavelli uses. Book 3 is the story of Florence moving into the 15th century. And I want to stop and look for a second at one particular speech that Machiavelli creates. It's in the mouth of an anonymous Florentine, which really means Machiavelli sort of making it up. But in this particular speech, it seems to me the person making it is a kind of vehicle for Machiavelli to present some of his ideas directly. First of all, he says Florentines have to abandon the private goods that they're all seeking and struggle for the public good. That it's necessary for Florentines to have this higher loyalty, that they should care about the state of Florence and not just about, is this particular thing good for me right now at this particular moment? Am I going to make an extra florin on this or that? And so we know that Machiavelli believes that if the people are well ordered, the people can govern, and they can govern well and govern wisely. And what Machiavelli's saying in this speech is, hey, Florentines, again, in the mouth of an anonymous Florentine, you guys are not doing that. You're acting disorderly. You're more interested in you than you're interested in the whole. Secondly, Machiavelli talks about the fact that Florence wrongly surrendered power to the Duke of Athens. Florence should have never done that. What a mistake that was. The Florentines indeed did correct it. Third, he says, what we learn from the deeds of Florentines is that what fortune deals to Florence can in fact be overcome. But again, it must be overcome with genuine planning and wisdom, and you won't find that if the citizens are all acting for the private good rather than the public good. Most of Book 3 deals with a series of movements that take place beginning in 1378. We call it the Revolt of the Ciompi. Ciompi are wool workers who were essentially disenfranchised because they did not have their own guild. They worked for guildsmen in the wool guild. And again, Machiavelli creates some wonderful speeches because this was a period of temporary overthrow of the Florentine constitution, creation of new guilds, the ascendancy of some pretty, economically and socially speaking, some lower level people taking top jobs. In one of the speeches, Machiavelli gives a great defense of the argument for human equality. People really are equal. And we've seen that Machiavelli believes in a basic kind of equality as a central part of the functioning of a republic. No doubt Machiavelli, as most Florentines, look back and say the Ciompi sort of didn't get the right meaning from equality. They didn't understand it the right way. They drew some false conclusions. But it's an interesting speech about equality. It's also true that although there was a great deal of violence and some temporary success, in fact, by 1381, the Ciompi rebellion was put down. And after Machiavelli talks about that, he talks about a couple important wars that Florence fought at the beginning of the 15th century. One against Milan and the Duke of Milan, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, and one against Ladislas, the King of Naples. One ending in 1402, the other ending in 1414. Both of them ended not because of Florentine victories, but because of the deaths of the leaders of the opponents of Florence. Machiavelli remarks, somewhat as a wag perhaps, that death has been Florence's best friend. And then Book 4 takes the story up to 1434. And Book 4 concludes the first half of this book. There are 8 books. So in this, we have the situation into which Cosimo de' Medici stepped in 1434. And Machiavelli says those who tried to stop the Medici from gaining power made some mistakes. First of all, as they were able to keep Lorenzo, or rather Cosimo de' Medici, sort of under control, they became insolent. They became somewhat too cocky about what they had done. And it turns out that the folks who had opposed the Medici were very long-lived, and they somehow thought that living long enough was going to take care of the problem. Secondly, they had a chance to sort of get Cosimo because Cosimo supported what turned out to be an unpopular war against the city of Lucca. However, these guys who were trying to get Cosimo set themselves up once the war started, sort of to run the war themselves. And when they lost, Cosimo didn't get all the blame, but the guys who ran the war. And so they made a mistake in sort of stepping into this thing that otherwise might have done Cosimo in. And then finally, they exiled Cosimo de' Medici, but they didn't finish the job. He went off to northern Italy, and they sort of left him alone there. And so when Cosimo did return in 1434, where Book 5 picks up, he was widely hailed as the father of his country.